Hey everybody, my name is Alex and this is LunchBox Radio, Sunday edition. Now, before we get started, I wanted to encourage everybody to listen to the podcast. I will have an advance recording thing happening because I am going to London for a couple days for professional reasons, but don't worry, there shouldn't be any disruption in the podcast. And if there is, I will let you know. So here's the thing. I talked about Star Wars Vision Season 1 last week. Coming up is the or Season 1 a little bit ago. Coming up is the my thoughts on Star Wars Vision Season 2. That'll be the next third edition that you get in the feed. But in between, I also talked about the Rise of Kyoshi novels over on the podcast. If you have not listened to the podcast, you can subscribe with the link in the description right beneath this video. And if you're listening to this, there's a YouTube channel now where the Sunday editions come out every other Sunday over on the LunchBox. I believe it's the LunchBox TV YouTube channel, but there'll be a link in the description of the podcast for that YouTube channel. So you can definitely go check out those in both directions, whichever way you want to do them. But between Star Wars Visions and my time with Avatar, since I am playing a tabletop RPG with my friend Lauren from the Uncanny Curd podcast, as well as two other friends, we are not putting that out on YouTube or anything because we're just having fun with it. But I've been thinking a lot about anime influence on stuff because in both of those cases, you have you have the anime as a medium exerting its influence on the stylistic trappings of Avatar: The Last Airbender, certainly, and then the kind of platform of what Star Wars has become and what Star Wars is to people. But the thing that always strikes me as interesting is that I have always really believed that you don't want to just assign anything the anime tag. And it's not, for me, it's not so much about whether or not the stuff was made in Japan, because the bottom line is that a lot of Japanese studios export their what's called in-between frames, which means that the people in the studio proper, the animator in the studio proper, are oftentimes doing what's called keyframing. If you don't know anything about animation, this will be a very short lesson, but there are two kinds of animation drawings. There are keyframes, which are typically the start and or beginning of an action. So if you're throwing a ball, the start would be this frame and the end would be that frame. The in-between frame, so it's the second kind of animation drawing, is all the little frames in between. So if you have a animation that's done on, let's say, 12 frames per second, and you only have a second of animation, the frame 1 and frame 12, actually frame 1, frame 6, and frame 12 are probably the three keyframes. Everything else in between that is considered to be an in-between frame. When you're a professional animation studio, oftentimes you don't have the budget or the time, and really it's not budget, it's time for that kind of constant sakuga moment to happen. So what ends up happening is you do the important scenes and then a out-of-house studio or freelancers do a lot of other parts of the work of making the thing come to life. So the kind of people's obsession with, oh, this was made in Japan, this wasn't, this was made in Japan, this wasn't, you can usually debunk that with like pretty standard hilarious moments like, oh, well, does that make Quasimodo 2? the movie a anime because that was made by Disney Japan, so technically it was made in Japan. So Quasimodo, so the Hunchback of Notre Dame 2 is anime, which is hilarious to me. Or you could claim the Batman the Animated Series as anime because it was largely the parts of it that were largely produced by Japanese animation studios. But the thing I'm usually concerned with is calling something like Avatar anime. Doesn't bother me except for when people get their fingers in the pie of let's use that lingo to make money. So you see this a lot with Netflix shows. There's been a bunch of shows that they've attempted to say, okay, this is anime. We are deciding that this is what we're calling anime, so people will watch it. And when you come to the shows, they don't feel right. Like it doesn't, the parts don't fit together properly to make the experience that you and I expect when we sit down and we watch anime. It's a very different experience than even edgier or harder edge American animation. And I said this in the podcast about Kyoshi, about Rise of Kyoshi, but I think that we don't give our own work enough credit. What I mean by that is we don't view the animation medium as valuable, especially in America, outside of children's entertainment when we should. And that's because people view animation as a genre and not a medium. When you're viewing something as a genre, it allows you to create all these trappings that don't exist if it's just seen as a medium. So a perfect example of animation as a medium versus a genre is the heavy metal animation project. If you've ever seen anything from heavy metal, the animation, you know that that's not for kids. Like it's not a thing that you want it's not a thing that you would want like Tommy to watch after he watched Teletubbies. The thing that has kind of broken this is, hilariously enough, stuff like Family Guy, stuff like Metalocalypse, stuff like American Dad, stuff that is oftentimes using people's preconception of cartoons, with the exception of Metalocalypse. That's like a very specific, made to look dark and gritty and terrifying and blah blah and hilarious, blah blah blah. But if you look at something like Family Guy and you look at something like American Dad, those look like all American cartoons. They don't look harmful. And then you actually watch them in motion and you're like, holy shit, this is not great. And from like a PG-13 scenario. So that's starting to mess with that in a really good way, because it's starting to say, hey, cartoons don't just have to be for kids and stoners. Like, it's not all Hanna-Barbera Scooby-Doo reruns from the 60s. It's not all Tom and Jerry reruns from the 40s. This is out there now too. And that's really what I think people feel when they watch something like, say, Avatar: Last Airbender, or Steven Universe, or She-Ra, or the She-Ra animation that's on Netflix, or even something like, what's the superhero animation that's on Amazon Prime? I forget what it's called. People feel that complexity of storytelling and that complexity of thought behind the production of this thing. It's not just cat versus mouse funny joke. Although Tom and Jerry at its best is a lot more than that. It's allowing the fullness of entertainment to exist within that medium. A really great example of this, that if you watch, you would not consider it anime, but it clearly is drawing a lot from the cyberpunk genre, which draws a lot necessarily from anime, and it's really in conversation with a lot of anime out there. Is a show that I've actually talked about on the podcast. Once again, if you're interested in listening to the podcast, the link for subscribing to it is in the description below. Is this show called Pantheon that was, I believe, an AMC original, but broadcast a whole bunch of places. I watched it on High Dive. I believe you can still watch it on High Dive. It's a real good time, but it's also very clearly a non-Japanese animation. It is a Western take on the cyberpunk genre with all the good and bad trappings that come with it. But because it has a maturity to its storytelling and to its treatment of its viewers, certainly, you get the same feel that you get from like a really good Ghost in the Shell standalone complex for this entire episode, and that's high praise. And the reason I want to talk about this again was because I spent a lot of time with the Avatar universe very recently, because I was trying to research for the tabletop game we were playing. I think I'd probably come to a close on my current round of time with that universe, although I might reread the comics because I really like those. But the thing that, and this is part of what what rubbed Nickelodeon the wrong way at the end of Korra, and what people like me who really like the Avatar universe did really like about Korra and did really like about Avatar in general, is that it approached that complexity of thought. It approached the idea of not treating the viewer like an absolute moron. So a great example of this in Avatar is when the original Avatar Last Airbender, when Aang is trying to figure out how to deal with Ozai, he has taken a vow of, he's not necessarily taken a vow of non-aggression, but taken a vow to not take any life as a monk in the Avatar universe. So he can't kill the guy. And the show, straight up, it's like, no, you gotta kill this dude. There's no way around it. That's the way that will fix the problem. And he spends, I think, a couple episodes, like an episode and a half at least, looking for ways to not do that. And eventually, by the end of the show, he finds a way to not kill this dude. But what the show does is it doesn't drag you along. It doesn't try and give you it. The show presents its own world as this harsh, unforgiving place, and as this kid who may at some point be forced to make this decision. And there's a version of that show where he is forced to like take Ozai's life, but he figures it out, and it's a genuine journey for him to figure it out, in the same way it's a genuine journey for him to not lose his earthly connections with all of his friends to be the perfect avatar. And the more you experience of the Avatar universe, the more it still has those conversations of what does it look like to be this like singular person in this world and have all of this responsibility but still be human. And whether it be for power fantasy reasons or whether it be for just a lack of need to look at stories differently, in things like Marvel and DC, the closest thing that America has had for a long time to that kind of big hero narrative that you see in something like Saint Seiya, it hasn't really been encouraged for those characters to look at themselves until pretty recently. I mean, Batman, yes, but certainly not Superman. Iron Man was a very specific thing for many years, and when he was brought to the screen, that changed a lot, and you were able to like steep in motivations and things that just when you're writing a comic book in the '60s, it's not that you're not interested in that, but it's not your priority. It's not the coolest idea. It's not the thing that sticks in people's heads. And I think that's why when people start throwing out like, oh, it's like an American anime. No, that's not. No, and I want to be careful here. No, it's not that that's not possible. It's that you're ascribing genre traits to a medium when you should be ascribing. We should accept that animation is a medium, and it's not what matters is not the animation that you're seeing is from Japan. What matters is what I've talked about previously. It's that largely anime as a genre does not tries not to treat its viewer like a moron. It is really interested in the internal workings of the characters as well as telling the stories. And it does that in an overt way instead of just kind of letting you have to interpret it through the through kind of little hints and moments for the story. One of the things that is super common in shonen anime is that they always have a love story of some kind in shonen anime. Sometimes it's part of the main story. Oftentimes it's like a side thing that's always there. A great example of this is Yu Hakusho. So if you've ever watched Yu Hakusho, you know that Yusuke and Keiko are constantly together. They are from very early on in the show. It's acknowledged that they just have feelings for each other, and no one screws with that. They are a committed relationship for that entire show. The show doesn't super focus on it at all times. It comes back to it for small moments, but it's always there. Even in something like Dragon Ball Z, Chi-Chi and Goku in the original Dragon Ball are like a thing. Bulma and Vegeta are a thing in Dragon Ball Z. Videl and Gohan become a thing in the middle of Dragon Ball Z. These are not things that need to happen. These are not things that are necessary to tell the story of big men with big muscles punch real good. But what it is it gives this dimension to all of these characters. It gives this weird dimension of like, at some point someone had to put Goku in a suit and like get him down a fucking aisle. And I know that's like weird, but it's part of the reason why we love it, because it doesn't try to pretend that stuff doesn't exist. It's answering the question of like, well, yeah, of course, like they would find a significant other and get married. Like, they're not robots. And oftentimes I think a lot of that is creators, and this has started to happen much more in all forms of animation, not just anime, but creators are much more willing to go deeper on their concepts than they would have previously. And I think what we've been experiencing with anime for years is creators who have gone that deep to begin with, who have always been like, this is this whole character's life. This is what this whole character's universe looks like. And it's why when you're watching it's why you feel different when you watch something like what's the name of that? When you watch that superhero show, the one with J.K. J.K. Simmons as the voice of the ultimately bad guy, and I forget what it's called. Um, you feel differently about that character than you feel about Superman. Because Superman, until recently, they didn't try and super make him human. He was always this big, immovable. He was always the big blue Boy Scout. In the Amazon show, which I really forget, I really wish I didn't because I really love that show. It hasn't been it's coming back, but it's taken a long break in my mind. Um, you see that whole universe, and it's not like and that show and the creator of that show made sure that those characters are truly in a universe. They're not even in like fake Smallville, like fake small town America. They're like in San Francisco or something. They're in a place that people exist in in modern world. And a lot of this is because the stuff was created more recently, so it is less it is less difficult to come up with something that doesn't feel like it to come up with something original than something that you have to like kind of move into the future. Like Superman was made a while ago when something like Smallville was more likely. They have had to kind of drag that thing kicking and screaming into new new consecutive generations and still acknowledge what was, but modernize it somehow so it doesn't feel as crazy. Um, and it's just I and like I said, I don't think it's. I think that we need to acknowledge that stuff like Avatar: The Last Airbender, that stuff like Steven Universe, that stuff like that all kinds of things in the world are anime inspired, but I think we really need to be careful about throwing around the term of anime because A, words have meaning, blah, 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 blah. But B, I don't think we want to give the people marketing this stuff that much credit. And I think we also want to point out to people marketing stuff like um Avatar and stuff like any of the odd Netflix stuff. That's still good. I'm not saying it's bad. It's really good, but it should be allowed to be good on its own merit. And to to try and say something like it's like a Western anime, to try and get somebody whose favorite show right now is Demon Slayer to watch She-Ra, and those are very different shows. Like they have some commonality, but like as an overarching thing, those are very different shows. The same person may still like both of those shows. That totally makes sense. But it's not fair to either of those shows to conflate them together because one could be very different, could be way better than the other in a completely different way. It's like saying this apple is better than this lemon. That's not the point. You've missed the point. And it's like, well, actually, it's because they're both fruit. That makes sense in this scenario. It's like saying this apple is better than this pancake. Why are we comparing apples to pancakes? Like, why is that necessary? They can both be good. It's fine. It doesn't. The people's people's need to say things is like it's like a Western version of anime. Is really a need to say this doesn't treat me like a moron, or this has these displays these traits that anime has displayed for years. We should really start saying things that way and instead of giving marketing departments of media companies around the world a tip that says, hey, if you market this as a cartoon, it may go well, it may not. But if you market this as anime, instant audience. And I don't think we want to do that to ourselves. And on that note, if you like this YouTube video, you can definitely subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you'll always get notified when there are new episodes available, which are roughly every other Sunday. So if you're watching this now, the Sunday after next will be the next one. And if you want to hear more of me, you can subscribe to the podcast. There is a link for that podcast in the description box below, where you can also ring the bell, subscribe, and comment and all that fun jazz. On that note, I have been Alex. This has been LunchBox Radio Sunday Edition, and I will talk to you on the podcast.